So at the moment, this is the people that constitute this group. So I'm now recently chair, so I think it's time for me to think about the important future actions. But there are other people from different countries, from Italy, Denmark, Netherlands, and men and women, and I think it's important to have both men and women involved in these issues. The ERC Gender Equality Plan was established quite a while ago, and it is periodically revised. And so I think this is an important aspect because it does set the ERC gender policy and objectives and the implementation plan. It is available to the general public on the ERC website, so I advise you to take a look. And also, I would like to stress the fact that gender equality plans are now absolutely imperatively necessary for any grant from the EU to be attributed to any grantees. At the ERC, we've been a little softer in that it hasn't been set as compulsory from the start of the application, but the institution where the grantees are hosted are meant to set this up if the grantee gets the grant. So here I have put this 7 magic number with a few objectives that we had set. So one is to raise awareness among potential applicants of ERC gender policy. So this is important for any people to apply and to think about what they would include in their application. We also wanted to improve the gender balance in the pool of applicants to ERC funding, to stress gender balance benefits for researchers in ERC teams, that can also be important, monitor gender-specific career following ERC's grant, and also to strive for gender balance among ERC peer reviewers, to identify and try to remove potential gender biases in ERC evaluation, and to embed gender awareness in all ERC processes from evaluation up to granting. So it's quite ambitious. And so here are a certain number of actions that were taken over the past years and how they have evolved. So I've sort of classified them in 4 main categories. One that has to do with extensions for application. So these have progressively been explored further. So they were initially extension by 12 months per child born after a PhD, then 18 months per child born before or after a PhD. Then there was no more limit to eligibility extension, whereas before there was a limit at 4 or 5 years. And so the 4th child, if any, was out. And care of sick relative are now considered as a reason for eligibility extension. I would like to stress that extension for children are also are also possible for men, and so this is something that we need to communicate perhaps better because it's not necessarily used as it could be. So then the proposal. So here we have in the proposal themselves reshuffled things around, and it's probably something we can continue to think about. So there was a removal of the section on scientific leadership potential, which was a self-evaluation, which was considered as giving a potential bias. We reversed the order of the evaluation criteria. Now it's the project and then the PI track record. The model CV template is included in application form. And the track record focuses on 5 to 10 publications, depending on the grant. Then with respect to the evaluation, there's this aspect about raising awareness of evaluator on unconscious bias. We had video and slides, and here it may be important to update and to think a bit more on this. The unconscious bias training for the ERCA scientific officers and management, which is also important. They are really key people to support the ERC action. And for the Scientific Council member, awareness session on unconscious bias had been put in place. And finally, incentives. And so here, I just want to mention that because people are not necessarily aware. Activities promoting equal opportunities or gender balance are eligible costs stated in the work program for the ERC. So one other type of action on gender-related action for underrepresented sex with sex and gender dimension was this workshop that we had organized in 2020, where the idea was to see how this is taken into account in frontier research, in particular at the ERC. So we had the pleasure at that occasion to have an introduction by Sabine Ortel-Prigione. So you can also access, I think, to the recorded session, so you may want to do that. And we had then 3 types of session. And these 3 types of session were chosen because at the ERC we cover broadly all areas of science. We have life sciences, we have physics and engineering, and we have social sciences, humanities. And so these are reflecting these 3 type of things, with first gender in medicine and medical care, second gender, demographic and behavior, and then gender and fairness in the digital society. And then there was a part for policy dialogue. So the outcome was to propose some innovative approaches and raise further awareness. And another thing that I felt was perhaps of interest to bring up is we realized also that the COVID-19 pandemic was a context that could also be important to consider in the way we look at things. And so in the ERC Work Program 2022, we have included in the application form a dedicated section to report on COVID-19 pandemic impact. And this is meant for us to be able to then analyze the data as well, and to be able to accommodate adjustments as needed. And so applicants have been affected differently, and they can report that. So it could be work, family, homeschooling, and all sorts of things. And so this will be there. And the analysis of this impact is pending. So we already have now a set of data we will review and probably soon have this information based on ERC data. So that's another point I would like to stress, is that ERC is really trying to collect data on how we proceed. So now, again, as I said, things have to evolve over time, so we monitor things over time. And so if we look at the data on applicants and grantees, here is an illustration over time. So you can see with respect to success rate by type of call, looking at starting, so the youngest people, consolidator, intermediate career, and advanced. You see here that from 2007 to 2013, that there were quite some differences between the success rate between men and women. And when we look at the data from age 2020, 2014 to 2020, there's definitely some improvement. I don't even need to stress this, but this is, and I just want to say, this is the success rate. So we have made progress here, but not necessarily sufficient progress on the amount of applicants, and this is something that we need to work on. So now if we look by domain, this is also very interesting, because you can see that now if we look at life science, physics and engineering, social science and humanities, there are differences that we could notice in the first series of call, 2007 to 2013. And you can see the progress in the different areas, which are slightly different. And so that may be also important for us to think about But we can also go further and refine and look into the different panels. And so that may be also important for us to think about effort to be focused on particular areas. So here you have, it's just showing over time, and I think it was important to show this because there's also a lot of variation in different years, and so we need to consider that this variability has to be taken into account. And you can see that there's an increased rate globally in 2021, and there was a dip in 2020. So this may be related to the COVID, but the curve for men and women were actually pretty good, and women have been quite successful lately. And so this is presenting rate by domains. So here we have not added the non-binary data. They represent a very small number, and then it would be difficult to compare to previous data. But just to tell you that we also now take this into account, and you see how things have actually progressed, and I think it's quite visible. So you have in plain the success rate for female, which is quite high, and in physics and engineering they should apply more. They are very successful when they apply, and so that's probably something also to bear in mind. So now I'd like to get back to this ERC workshop that we had on sex and gender dimension in frontier research, to highlight some of the topics that were covered, and you can take a look at this in more detail if you want, because all of these presentations are available on site. So there was in the session on gender and medicine and medical care, one point about sex bias in preclinical research, why it exists and why change has been slow. So I think it's important not only to learn about what had happened, but why and whether that can be accelerated. Then the aspect about two sexes, one genome, and sex-specific genetic effects on fitness and human disease. So here that shows that certain type of research carried out by ERC grantees here really enlight differences according to sex on these aspects. Then genetic investigation and challenging in atypical vascular disease, where there's a predominance in women that are not necessarily studied as much as we would hope. And then the sex of organ with the aspect of gut and sex. Session 2 on gender, demographics and behavior. So here there was first general presentation on the gender dimension in economic research. I think it's important also to think about that dimension. And there was a presentation entitled Boys Will Be Boys, about the childhood origins of gendered societal roles. So we also need to understand these things. Then Equalize, a project on equalizing or disequalizing and opposing socio-demographic determinants of the spatial distribution of welfare. So I think this is also important in connection to the welfare of people. Then with cancer, how women cancer, the variation in pattern of care can explain worldwide inequalities in survival and premature death. So that's also important to take into account. Then in the digital society, I was thrilled to hear all the points that Londa made, because people tend to miss this aspect. And so I think that's important to see what AI bias has, and so that's one of the aspects that was covered. And then fair social computing, and so gender bias in algorithmic decision making, that has been covered. And in terms of connection, so migration, digital media and emotions, another aspect that was covered. So I've listed here the people, because I thought it was also interesting for you to see that at ERC we had projects in different areas and at different levels from a variety of people, and here again men and women. So in life science, an advanced grant, starting grant as well, We had in social and human science starting grant, several of them. We also had consolidator grant, advanced grant, and you can see also in physics and engineering. So just to show that this, in terms of breadth, is ranging over the whole scope. I will be on time, no worry. So I also wanted to stress that in addition to the 3 types of grant I had mentioned, starting, consolidator, and advanced, there's the Synergy project, and you'll have the pleasure. So anyway, I'm introducing the next speaker, Nathalie Bajos, who is coordinating this Synergy project. And I think that it would be really interesting. I'm not going to give away a message, but I think it's also nice to see that it's in a way illustrating here the intersectional aspect by bringing together people from different areas. So that's all I wanted to say here, but I'm looking forward to hear more about. So perhaps a few things. So on each of the sessions, we had some take-home messages that I would like to briefly cover. So the main conclusion for the first session, medicine and medical care, was that ERC supported research clearly presented that there are sex differences that account for biological variation. So that's something we cannot ignore. It's the case both in vitro and in vivo, both in human and other species, such as fruit flies, at all levels, from the cellular level up to the organ level, so it's really broad. And in addition, analyzing sex difference is key to better understand the biological basis, as well as for better, fair, and equalitarian healthcare research and treatment. So these are important aspects. So for gender demographic and behavior, here, the discussion brought up the importance of integrating gender dimension in the social science as well as in epidemiology to ensure robustness, representation, and validity of the question addressed and results obtained. So gender-blind analysis can lead to devastating results by supplying biased evidence for economic, educational, and epidemiological policies. Now, with the digital society, here I think a clear and thought-provoking insight into how bias from wide or partial data sets need to be addressed when used in conjunction with artificial intelligence. So the automated translation services, internet searches, auto-completion, and image analysis, we've seen that. And the presenter also highlighted the need for the interdisciplinary approach involving social science to understand and potentially correct algorithmic bias. And so policymakers have a role to play in driving changes, and so the European Commissioner Elena Dalli emphasizes that, and so gender equality is essential for innovation and scientific advancement. The Commission new gender equality strategy has placed gender equality at the core of EU policy development. And to promote full participation of women in science, we have now this requirement in all institutions to have a gender equality plan. So I think this is something to remember. As a conclusion, I think that it was nice that Martini Donald, who was discussing with 2 members of the parliament, Mark Angel and Lina Galvez-Munoz, they all agree that collecting good quality data is the basis for robust policy-driven initiative. However, these data on men and women in different scientific fields are still scarce, and answering questions about women's representation in different academic disciplines is essential to motivate and correct actions. And it was nice that they set the point about the ERC as an example of how to collect data and publish them, so you can access to all of them. And finally, this message from Martini is that policymakers and funders, as well as individual researchers, all have their own part to play in ensuring that sex and gender are appropriately fed into the design of cutting-edge research programs, and that fairness in the award of such grant is maintained with constant vigilance over each stage of any process. So I would like to stop there, and thank you for your attention.